This happened a couple of years ago. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but I don't talk about it much. Makes you sound crazy real quick. My name's Lucas. Outdoors guy, hunting, fishing, camping, that's where I feel alive. Or at least I did. After this, the woods don't feel the same anymore. It was elk hunting season, and I'd set up at Yellowstone National Park near the park's eastern edge. Not exactly untouched wilderness, but still wild enough to satisfy the craving. My RV was nestled among the pines, with the Tetons towering in the distance like silent gods. I'd been out here for a couple of days, and the elk weren't moving much. Frustrating, but I decided to make the most of it with a hike. There was this trail, not officially marked, but a clear path winding into the backcountry. I liked those. Fewer tourists, more solitude. Slinging my rifle over my shoulder, I headed out, the cool air biting and the forest around me alive with quiet murmurs. That's when I found it. A gut pile. Hunters leave these behind after field dressing their kill, common practice. But this one, it was wrong. The entrails were arranged neatly, too neatly. There was no sign of scavengers tearing into them, no tracks in the surrounding dirt. At the center of it all sat a single bleached deer jawbone, pristine and deliberate. It wasn't a mess, it was a display. The woods shifted around me, their energy snapping cold and foreign. My gut screamed, "Leave." I gripped my rifle tighter and backed away, the primal fear gnawing at the edge of my mind. By the time I made it back to the RV, I couldn't shake the unease. The way the trees pressed in felt predatory, watching, waiting. Night fell, and with it came the silence. A suffocating, unnatural silence that set every nerve on edge. I barely drifted off before a crash jolted me upright. The RV shook, and my heart pounded as I grabbed my rifle. Peering out the window, I saw nothing but shadowed trees. Then it happened again. Louder, closer. The sound wasn't random, it had a rhythm, deliberate and malicious. Bang! 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 Something or someone was pounding on the RV, testing it. My breath hitched. My grip on the rifle turned my knuckles white. The pounding stopped. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They circled the RV, their weight pressing into the gravel with terrifying precision. Whoever, or whatever it was, it knew I was alone. It wanted me to know it too. The steps stopped at the driver's door. I could almost hear the hand hovering above the handle, waiting, testing me. Then came a violent slam at the back of the RV, hard enough to rattle the cabinets and send me stumbling. And then the scraping began. It came from underneath the RV, metal on metal, slow and purposeful. My stomach churned as I imagined something crawling beneath me, clawing its way up. I held my breath as the sound climbed higher, scratching along the walls, inching closer to the windows. It wasn't trying to break in. Not yet. It was playing. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to sunlight spilling into the RV. The woods were quiet again, almost mockingly peaceful. I stepped outside to investigate, rifle at the ready. No footprints. No scratches. No sign that anyone or anything had been there. But I knew. The fear still coiled tight in my gut like a living thing. That evening, the dread came back with the shadows. Waiting for whatever had visited the night before felt like a death sentence. When darkness fully fell, I made my choice. Grabbing my rifle, a few supplies, and my keys, I started the RV. The engine roared, shattering the silence as I sped off the gravel road, the headlights carving shaky beams through the endless forest. Every mile felt like borrowed time. When I finally reached the crossroads, I saw a flickering sign for a rest stop hidden among the trees. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer than the open road. I pulled the RV into the pines, parking it out of sight, and waited. But the woods weren't done with me. At first, it was faint, a scraping sound, distant and intermittent, just enough to make my skin crawl. Then it grew louder, echoing through the trees. It was coming closer. The sun began to rise, and I decided I couldn't wait any longer. Leaving the RV behind, I grabbed my rifle and headed into the forest. Every step felt like a gamble. Every crack of a branch sent my pulse racing. Hours passed before I stumbled onto a truck stop. The sight of people, normalcy, nearly brought me to tears. When I told my story to the sheriff, I expected skepticism. Instead, I got questions, serious ones. Reports of missing hikers, strange disturbances, eerie displays in the woods. They brought in a park ranger, a grizzled man who didn't flinch when I mentioned the gut pile or the pounding on the RV. The ranger's face was grim. "You're lucky you left," he said. "Most don't." They escorted me back to the campground, but the RV was gone. Not stolen, removed. Whatever was out there, the authorities didn't want anyone finding it again. They didn't say what they thought it was. A poacher? A cult? Something worse? I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. To this day, I don't go back into the woods. Not because I'm afraid of monsters. What haunts me is the knowledge that someone, or something, out there took pleasure in hunting me. And they're still out there, waiting for the next camper to stray too far into their territory. This happened years ago, back when my life was unrecognizable from what it is now. I was a workaholic, drowning in deadlines and stress over things that seem laughably trivial in hindsight. The only reprieve from that suffocating grind was my best friend, Ain. His easy humor and our late-night hangouts were the only things that kept me sane. When a long weekend rolled around, An suggested a camping trip. I pushed for a hotel by a pool, desperate for cocktails and air conditioning. But An, oddly insistent, argued for solitude among ancient trees. It was unlike him. He loved creature comforts as much as I did. But his determination was unsettlingly firm. Begrudgingly, I gave in. We took his RV deep into the vast, shadowy expanse of the Sioa National Forest. The air there was thick with age, the towering trees standing as silent witnesses to centuries. Our campsite was tucked far from any trace of humanity, an isolation that felt both thrilling and disquieting. Cell service was non-existent. A small blessing, or so I thought. That first night, we cooked over the fire. An burned everything he touched, turning even marshmallows into blackened clumps. He laughed it off, but there was something off about him, his eyes constantly darting toward the surrounding darkness. When I asked, he shrugged and muttered about just being tired. The uneasy tension hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. When we finally turned in, I fell into a restless sleep. Then the scratching started. It was faint at first, a tentative testing scrape against the RV's metal walls. But it grew louder, angrier, until it sounded like something was trying to rip its way inside. My heart thundered as I sat up, adrenaline washing over me. "An?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I stumbled to the front of the RV, only to find his bed empty. Panic clawed at my chest as I peered out the window. There he was, standing stock still in the eerie glow of the dying fire, his back to me, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. My relief was short-lived. Just beyond the flickering flames, a figure lurked. It was not human. The thing was impossibly tall, its emaciated body wrapped in ragged strips of what looked like decayed flesh. Its head hung at a grotesque angle, but its eyes, those hollow, gleaming voids, were fixed on An. My gut twisted in terror. The creature lunged. I screamed as it tackled An with terrifying speed. He didn't even have time to react. The struggle was brief, a flurry of movement, too fast for my mind to process, and then An's screams were swallowed by silence. The fire crackled softly, mockingly, as if nothing had happened. I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled to the door and opened it. The cool night air thick with the coppery tang of blood. I called his name, but the only response was the distant rustle of leaves. The firelight barely reached the edge of the clearing, where the blood trail vanished into the impenetrable forest. And then I heard it. The heavy, labored breathing of something massive. I didn't wait to see it. I bolted back into the RV, locking every door and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, the headlights slicing through the dark. As I reversed onto the dirt road, the beams illuminated a horrific sight. Drag marks streaked with fresh blood, disappearing into the forest. And there it stood, hunched at the edge of the light, staring straight at me. It started running. I floored the gas, the RV lurching forward. The thing moved faster than anything should, closing the distance as if it were toying with me. Suddenly, a deafening crash shook the vehicle, sending it skidding off the road and into the trees. Smoke billowed from the crumpled hood. My chest heaved as I realized I couldn't drive away. I had no choice. I ran. Branches tore at my skin as I plunged into the forest, the snapping of twigs behind me growing louder, closer. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but sheer terror drove me forward. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a death knell. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I stumbled out of the trees onto a rocky cliffside. Below, bathed in the cold light of the moon, was a clearing littered with bones. Human bones, animal bones, bones I couldn't identify. In the center of the carnage knelt the creature, hunched over a mangled corpse, its jaws working methodically. I gagged, bile rising in my throat, and then I stepped on a twig. The sound seemed to echo endlessly. Slowly, impossibly, the creature's head turned toward me. Its lifeless eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it rose, its grotesque form towering above the blood-soaked ground. I ran. Branches whipped my face and my legs screamed for rest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound of its pursuit was a thunder in my ears. Somehow, miraculously, I burst onto a dirt road just as a pickup truck rounded the bend. I waved my arms, screaming incoherently, and the driver skidded to a stop. I was safe. The police found my RV the next day, battered and bloodied. They searched the forest for An, but there was no sign of him. No body, no creature, just the RV and the faint scent of death lingering in the air. They didn't believe me. Nobody did. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of scratching. It starts small, almost imperceptible, and then it grows louder, more insistent. I tell myself it's just the wind. But deep down, I know it's waiting. A couple of years ago, I went on a trip that still has me glancing over my shoulder, even in broad daylight. I'm no stranger to hiking. Grew up in the suburbs, so I have that love-hate relationship with the great outdoors. It calls to you, tempting you with the allure of escape, but then there's that nagging thought. Nature's not always your friend. My buddy Cade, a born and bred Colorado native, knows the land like the back of his hand. Me? I'm Joel, the reluctant city boy adventurer. I'm good with maps, but not much else when it comes to survival. Cade talked me into this trip. We were heading out to Nevada, to the Basin and Range National Monument, a place that sounds serene in name but is known for its isolation. We were so far off the beaten path, not a soul for miles. That should have been the first sign. The first night was peaceful. Cade set up the RV while I made a half-hearted attempt at starting a campfire. I was bad at it, but it didn't matter. We were alone, miles from civilization, and honestly, I started feeling uneasy. But we had a few beers, laughed it off, and for a while, everything was fine. That was until the second day. We set off on our planned route. Nothing too crazy, just enough to test my novice legs. The sun hung heavy, relentless in its midday heat. Then Cade suddenly stopped in his tracks. There was a shape on the trail, Something white, almost fabric-like, soaked in the unmistakable dark rust of dried blood. And next to it, half buried in the dust, a bone. I didn't need a biology degree to know that wasn't any deer leg. This bone was massive, thick, and the joint was wrong. Way wrong. It didn't take a genius to realize that whatever had left it behind wasn't something we wanted to meet. We backed up, eyes scanning the horizon, but we didn't say much. We just made our way back to the RV at double speed. When we got back, it got worse. All 4 of my tires were slashed clean through. My chest tightened with panic, a fist clutching at my heart. Cade checked his phone. Nothing. No bars. That's when the noise started. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals. It was something off. Rustling, followed by guttural, deep grunts that I couldn't place. Coyotes? Maybe? But even I didn't believe that. They didn't sound like anything natural. I gripped the flashlight like it might do something, anything to help. We weren't sleeping out there that night. Cade packed us some supplies, and we made the decision to walk. Walk until we found cell service. Maybe even a road that led somewhere with people. But the leg bone kept flashing in my mind, over and over. Whatever had torn that animal apart, I didn't want to run into it. Especially not in the dark. Surrounded by jagged rock formations reaching out like crooked fingers. We walked in silence, the air thick with tension. We didn't talk, we just listened. Strained for any hint of movement, any more of those gut-wrenching grunts. Hours passed. Miles. Finally, Cade's phone flickered to life. 1 bar. My hope surged, but it was too brief. The signal was weak, barely enough for a call. Cade dialed 911. An automated message. Nothing more. The signal vanished as quickly as it appeared. The quiet hit me like a cold, suffocating weight. That's when I knew. We were alone out there. Trapped. At the first sign of dawn, the pale light didn't bring comfort. It brought dread. It wasn't long before Cade spotted something on the trail. Fresh paw prints. Not just any prints, but huge, deep ones. Twice the size of a mountain lion's. They were fresh, and something about the claws, they weren't right. Cade knelt for a closer look, then glanced up at me. No words were needed. We both knew whatever made those prints wasn't natural. It wasn't something we should mess with. The RV felt impossibly far away, but as the grunting started again, now closer, it felt like the only safe place left. The fear gnawed at me, sharp as a knife. We broke into a run, our breaths ragged, our legs burning. But every time I glanced behind me, the sounds grew closer, the grunts louder. Finally, we reached the RV, gasping for breath. Cade shoved me inside and locked the door just as something heavy thudded against the side of the vehicle. The sound echoed around us, sending chills down my spine. Thud. Another. Then another. I imagined the RV tipping over, sending us tumbling into the darkness with whatever that thing was hunting us. Through the sliver of moonlight, I saw it. Just a flash, enough to burn the image into my mind. I can't unsee it. 2 legs, yes, but hunched, moving in an unnatural way. The shoulders were too wide for its squat torso, and its head was too low, like it was sniffing the air, scenting us like prey. My stomach churned. I thought I might throw up. The thuds continued, punctuated by those grunting sounds that were half-human, twisted, mocking us as they echoed through the night. The sounds lingered, never letting us forget. Dawn came, but it didn't bring peace. Cade dared to check outside. I stayed hidden under the table, my heart pounding. His voice came back, thick with horror. Something had changed. When we stepped outside, the campsite was a horror show. Blood everywhere, dragged across the ground, smeared on the tires. But there was no body, no sign of what had happened. I didn't ask. I didn't need to know. We left, fast. By some miracle, we flagged down a passerby, And by the time we made it to the police, I'm sure we looked like delusional idiots, rambling about animal prints and grunts. The report probably said something about a mountain lion attack. Hiker trauma. Maybe. I sure wish I could believe that, but I can't. We never went back to Basin and Range. Hell, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the wilderness again without at least 3 people and a satellite phone. And even now, back in the safety of my suburban home, I can't shake the feeling. When the light starts to fade, I keep my eyes peeled. Because whatever that thing was, it's still out there. Watching, waiting, and it knows what fear smells like. This happened to me over 2 decades ago, and it still feels like a twisted dream every time I try to piece it together. Back then, life wasn't as complicated. I had a desk job that drained me, and the RV was my big escape. I'd seen enough of the cubicle life and longed for the freedom of the open road. I bought an old, beat-up Winnebago and fixed it up myself. My name's Kai, by the way. I was determined to freelance my way across the country, chasing good weather and distant horizons, living on cheap campsites when the money ran low. Nothing felt better than waking up and seeing nothing but open land, no skyscrapers, no city noise. One fall, I found myself near the Mojave National Preserve. That place, it had a vibe, a strange aura about it. Beautiful, yes, but unsettlingly isolated. The deeper I drove, the less I saw of anything that resembled civilization. No road signs, no power lines, nothing. Just endless, harsh desert stretching in every direction. It seemed like the perfect place to settle for a couple of nights and lose myself in the silence. The first day went by without incident. I parked by a dry lake bed, miles away from the nearest dirt road. The sunset there was like something out of a dream. But the next morning, that's when the oddness started. I was going through my usual routine. Coffee brewing on the camp stove, laptop open for work, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought maybe I'd finally get a chance to talk to another human being after all this time. But as the figure drew closer, I realized something was off. It wasn't a car. It wasn't even a horse or any animal I could recognize. It was a golf cart, an old, battered electric one, crawling its way across the desert sand. The cart came to a slow stop beside the RV, and that's when I saw him. The driver. I couldn't tell how old he was. He could have been anywhere from 60 to 90, but his face looked ancient. Sunken eyes that had seen too much, skin that was as cracked and weathered as the desert floor. His clothes were faded, sun-bleached, and his hair, this thick, greasy shock of gray, stuck out from beneath a fisherman's hat like a bird's nest. He looked at me with eyes so blank, it felt like he was staring right through me. I had to raise my voice to be heard over the sputtering motor. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared, unblinking. Finally he spoke, his voice like gravel being ground together. "Park's closed." I looked around at the empty wasteland, not a soul in sight. "Closed?" I asked, incredulous. "To who?" "You need permits out here," he rasped. "I didn't see yours." At that point, I figured he was just some eccentric desert hermit with a strange power trip. "Look, I'm happy to move if it's a problem," I said, trying to sound reasonable. But then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a cruel, jagged thing, like the grin of a predator. His yellowed teeth glinted in the weak sunlight. He pointed vaguely into the distance, far out toward the horizon. "Out yonder. Long way yonder." And then, without another word, he reversed the golf cart and trundled off into the barren landscape, vanishing into the emptiness. I spent the rest of the day on edge, my mind spinning with what had just happened. Was he just some oddball with a weird obsession? Or was there something more to it? A park ranger in exile, maybe? But why did I feel like something darker was at play? When night fell, the silence was suffocating. No crickets, no wind, not even a rustle of leaves. Just absolute, oppressive quiet. I tried to push the unease from my mind, but it clung to me, making my skin crawl. Around midnight, my battery-powered lantern flickered and died, plunging the RV into darkness. The curtain was drawn, but the air outside felt thick, suffocating. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the sand just outside the RV. I froze. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. Then that golf cart sound again. It circled the RV, drawing closer with each pass. Closer until the weak beam of its headlights cut through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The cart didn't stop. It just sat there in the dark, its engine idling, like whoever was behind the wheel was waiting, watching. For what felt like an eternity, it sat there, unmoving. Then, finally, it turned and drove off, disappearing back into the desert night. The morning came, and with it, a brief sense of relief. Daylight had to make it all feel ridiculous, right? But when I went to pack up and leave, I found something that turned my stomach cold. Under one of the RV's wheels, there was something strange. It wasn't a carcass or trash or any kind of debris. It was my internet hotspot. The antenna was snapped clean off, the wiring cut with precision. My stomach dropped. The man hadn't just wanted me gone. He wanted me cut off. Isolated. Alone. I didn't waste another second. I threw everything into the RV, fired up the engine, and didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station. My heart was still racing. I reported the incident to the police, of course, but I didn't tell them the full story. I kept it simple. I'd seen some vagrant out in the desert, a disturbance. Nothing more. They wrote it up, but no one took it seriously. No one believed me. No one went out there to look for the old man, and maybe that's just as well. As for me, I'm still drawn to the open road, the wide skies. But there's one place I'll never go again, that stretch of desert. The Mojave. It keeps its secrets well, and some secrets are better left alone. A few years ago, I experienced something so disturbing that even now, thinking back, it still sends chills down my spine. At the time, I laughed it off nervously, dismissing it as the product of a mind stretched too thin. But now, I know it was far from laughable. It's a story that haunts me, no matter how hard I try to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind. I'm an engineer by trade, a numbers guy. Skepticism is my second skin. I've always prided myself on being level-headed, but there are still pieces of that week in Red Creek that don't add up. Puzzles that seem designed to make you question the very fabric of reality. My buddy Corin was the outdoorsman. He could fish, hunt, and survive in the wild with just a knife and a pack of matches. He invited me to join him on a week-long RV camping trip. Just the two of us. Beers, maybe a fish or two if we were lucky. His choice was the Red Creek Reserve in Utah. A remote, desolate place that was nothing but a canyon, a few old mines, and the harsh, blood-red earth that gave the area its name. It was the kind of place Corin thrived in, where he could escape from the noise of the world and lose himself. I didn't know much about the history of Red Creek at the time, but I found out soon enough. Locals would whisper about the place, telling tales of strange disappearances, of things lurking in the shadows near the old gold rush mine, places people were warned to avoid. Still, we brushed it off. Skeptics, after all. The first day there was perfect. The kind of perfect that only comes when you're isolated from everything. The RV was parked at the edge of the canyon, the view sprawling out beneath us. The silence was thick, uninterrupted. Corin and I fished, talked about old times, and had a few beers. But then, on day 2, something changed. It started as a flash, a glint of light far down in the canyon. I caught it out of the corner of my eye, like something had reflected the sunlight off a piece of metal. Then I saw movement, something large, humanoid, moving along the edge of the trees. It wasn't a bear. No, this was something different. "Corin, do you see that?" I asked, my heart suddenly in my throat. He squinted and shrugged, dismissing it with a lazy, "Probably just a deer or something." But I wasn't so sure. A deer wouldn't move like that, not with that unnatural rhythm. Grabbing my camera, I decided to get a better look, scrambling down the slope toward the canyon's edge. As I got closer, the shape became clearer, and that was when I felt it. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. It was huge, too large for a man, its posture unnervingly wrong. I retreated quickly, embarrassed for having gone down there alone. We laughed it off that night, joking about Bigfoot and how absurd the whole thing was. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, sleep didn't come easy. It wasn't fear, per se, but a low, crawling unease, like something was watching me. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something shuffling outside the RV. It was too quiet to be an animal, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. There was nothing there when I checked, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't explain it. Day 3 is when everything shattered. Corin decided to fish upstream that morning, promising to return by lunch. But lunch came and went, and Corin didn't. Hours passed. By mid-afternoon, I was beginning to worry. Maybe he'd slipped and gotten hurt, or wandered too far and gotten lost in the trees. It was plausible. The path upstream was rocky, dangerous in places. That was before I found his fishing rod. It wasn't just abandoned. It was broken. The end was splintered, the line severed in jagged, uneven cuts that made no sense. It wasn't a fall. It was as if something had violently torn it apart. The moment I saw it, the cold dread I'd been pushing down exploded, washing over me. I didn't even stop to pack my stuff. I ran, straight up the narrow trail to the parking lot, heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the trailhead, there was no one. No cars, no people, no sign of anyone who had passed through. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. My breath came in ragged gasps as panic started to set in. I couldn't leave without Corin. I couldn't just run. I sat in my car, staring into the darkening woods, the knot of fear tightening in my stomach. That was when I heard it, the distant, mournful sound of a siren. The police had been called. Someone had reported my RV abandoned. They took me back to the reserve, shone their flashlights around, asked their questions. I didn't have answers. No one had seen Corin. The search party that arrived at dawn found nothing. No sign of him, no sign of a struggle. Just nothing. He was gone, vanished into thin air. And I couldn't explain it. No one could. 2 weeks later, the package arrived. No return address, nothing to suggest where it had come from. Inside, I found Corin's camera. The SD card was tucked next to the battery hatch. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop, the screen lighting up with images I wasn't prepared to see. At first, the pictures seemed normal. Corin, casting his line, shots of the creek, trees swaying in the wind. But then the images blurred, distorted as if the camera had been jostled. Then the video started. It was Corin, running. No, not running. Fleeing, with a look of sheer terror in his eyes. The camera swayed wildly, capturing glimpses of something towering behind him. It was tall. Unnaturally tall. The figure was pale, almost gray, with hair that hung in dark, tangled clumps. It wasn't a man, at least not anymore. Then the camera hit the ground, the lens pointing skyward. And the sounds, God, the sounds, Corin's screams, a sickening crunching noise, and then that laugh, low, rasping, inhuman, like something playing with its prey. The video cut out abruptly, and the screen went black. The police took the camera. They didn't find any signs of tampering, but when I described the creature in the woods, the officer gave me that look. The one they give you when they think you're losing your mind. I couldn't forget. I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw, what I heard. Months passed, but the images lingered. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow stretching just a little too long, seemed to carry the weight of that thing. The thing that took Corin. They declared Corin dead after a while. They called it an animal attack, but there were 2 more disappearances in Red Creek after that. The same pattern. People vanishing, always near the abandoned mine. Locals are talking now. There's something in the mine, something that's been there for longer than anyone can remember, but they still won't speak of it openly. They'll tell you their stories in hushed tones, as if afraid that simply saying it aloud will invite the thing to come for them next. Corin never came home. I don't know if he's dead or if he's still out there, somewhere, caught in whatever nightmare took him. But sometimes, late at night, I watch the video again, focusing on the first moments. The flash of movement in the trees, the thing that wasn't quite human, the twisted amusement in its laughter. I can't leave it alone. I have to go back. To Red Creek. Alone. People will think I'm crazy. But I have to. I need to know if there's something I missed, some detail I overlooked, something that will explain this, or maybe, just maybe, bring me some kind of closure. But if I find nothing, if there's no answer, no explanation, I'll be done. Because if all these disappearances are just random accidents, then maybe the world really is a much darker, more terrifying place than I ever realized. And that thought, more than anything, might be what finally breaks me. This happened to me a few years ago. Back then, I was deep into the whole digital nomad thing. Why pay rent when I could work remotely and explore the country? I got lucky and found a cheap old RV. It wasn't much, small and worn, but it was mine. My name's Ryland, by the way. After a rough patch working odd jobs in Vegas, I decided to head up to Yellowstone National Park for some serious alone time. But Yellowstone? It's massive. Overrun with people. I couldn't feel a connection to nature. It was just one giant crowd. Then one day, a ranger gave me a tip. Head to Shawn National Forest. Less traffic, just as beautiful. So I packed up and drove down winding gravel roads until I found a small, secluded campsite. Finally, the solitude I was craving. The first few days were perfect. I hiked, took some photographs for my portfolio, felt more alive than I had in months. But on the 3rd morning, I woke to an odd buzzing sound. Thought it was just a mosquito at first. I swatted at the air, sat up, and froze. Right outside my RV window, barely an arm's reach away, hovered a drone. But this wasn't any ordinary drone. It looked homemade, cobbled together from junk. Wires hanging out, a cheap camera mounted at an awkward angle. It looked wrong. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of park surveillance, a mix-up or malfunction. I got dressed and went outside, walking around the RV, scanning the trees for anyone nearby. But there was nothing. No people. No sound, just silence. I called out, but there was no response. The drone didn't even flinch. It just hovered there, staring at me like it was waiting for something. I went back inside, watched it through the window, my mind spinning. Who was flying this thing? And why was it here? That night, the drone came back. Same thing, hovering right outside, almost mocking me. I grabbed some of my old equipment and tried jamming the signal, but nothing worked. Frustrated, I threw a shoe at it, trying to scare it off. But that only made it worse. The drone zipped off into the darkness, its little propellers buzzing faintly until it disappeared. The next morning, I woke up to a flat tire. Someone had slashed it. I swapped it out myself. but something in me snapped. I called the Rangers, filed a report. They weren't too concerned. They said they'd investigate, but unless they caught the person in the act, there wasn't much they could do. I thought about leaving, but maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe whoever was flying that drone had gotten their kicks and wouldn't come back. I should have known better. That night, I decided to sleep away from the RV. I figured whoever was targeting me might be using motion sensors or something. So I grabbed my backpack, flashlight, and sleeping bag, and wandered a bit deeper into the woods. I found a small clearing beneath some low-hanging pines and set up for the night. It was peaceful. I was ready to put the whole thing behind me. But then, around midnight, I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of branches underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a shadow slip between the trees moving towards me. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and froze. He was close. Too close. The man stood just a few feet away. His face was hidden beneath a hoodie, and he gripped a long, rusty hunting knife in one hand. But it wasn't just the knife that made my blood run cold. It was his eyes. They were hollow, as if they weren't looking at me at all, like they were staring straight through me. My stomach twisted into a knot. In that moment, I knew. I had to get away. I lunged at him, tried to shove past him, but he was stronger than he looked. He slammed me into a tree with a sickening thud, knocking the flashlight from my hand. My head spun. He was on me in a flash, shoving me down into the pine needles. The knife glinted in the moonlight. I was paralyzed, too terrified to move. And then, just as I thought I was done for, I heard it. The sound of my RV engine roaring to life. The man froze. His head snapped around, and before I could react, he was sprinting back toward the RV. I didn't waste a second. The adrenaline surged through me like fire. I scrambled to my feet and bolted into the woods, not looking back. His shouts echoed in the trees behind me, unintelligible and full of rage. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed beneath another tree, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. Morning came slowly, like some cruel dream. I managed to find my flashlight and hiked back to the RV. The engine was off now, but the door was wide open. Inside, everything was trashed, my gear scattered, my things thrown around. But the drone, it was there too, busted up on the floor. And the tire marks, in the dirt, they told the story. He'd tried to steal my stuff, but had been interrupted when the engine roared to life. That was my chance. I jumped in, floored it, and didn't stop until I reached a gas station. I called the cops, but when they arrived and investigated, they found something far worse. Traces of blood on my backpack and a rundown cabin in the woods, miles away. It didn't belong to a park ranger. Hell, it didn't belong to anyone sane. I still don't know what he wanted. He didn't take anything valuable. Maybe he wasn't after my stuff at all. And that drone? I rebuilt it. It flies with me now when I hike, buzzing around, keeping watch. I'll never let my guard down again. Because sometimes the woods don't want you to leave. And sometimes the people lurking there, they're not after your things. They're after something far worse. This happened to me a long time ago. Maybe 10 years now. Back then, my buddy Kellen and I spent every summer together, fishing, hiking, and camping out in some of the most remote corners of the Pacific Coast. We grew up on the shores of Southern California, and you'd be hard-pressed to find two guys more in love with the wilderness. I had an amateur interest in photography back then, nothing serious, but Kellen knew it was something I enjoyed. So, when he suggested a trip up the coast to a secluded stretch of the Olympic National Park in Washington, he asked me to come along and document the beauty. Naturally, I jumped at the chance. One crisp, sunny morning, We packed up my old RV. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for long cross-country trips. It wasn't an off-road monster, but with Kellen behind the wheel, we had faith. We crossed the Oregon border, turning west and leaving the paved highways behind. The road soon became a narrow, winding dirt path that seemed to sink deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees grew massive, their thick trunks soaring into the sky, their canopy blotting out the sun entirely. The further we went, the darker the forest grew. Every once in a while, a logging road branched off, but we stayed on the main path. The trees felt like they were closing in on us, and my gut was telling me we were straying too far from civilization. We finally found a spot to pull over, barely wide enough for the RV to fit. A tiny creek ran nearby, making it feel like the perfect little slice of paradise. The first day was peaceful enough. Hiking down a well-worn trail, snapping photos of the sunlight filtering through the trees, roasting hot dogs over the fire, laughing and talking about old memories. It was everything we'd been craving. A perfect escape into the wild. We slept soundly, the air fresh and crisp, the smell of pine clinging to everything. The next morning came just as we'd hoped. The world was still, serene. I grabbed my camera bag and Kellen shouldered his fishing gear, and we parted ways. Me to wander and photograph the forest, him to try his luck at the creek. We figured we'd meet back at the RV in 2 hours. At first it was everything we hoped it would be. The moss hanging from the trees was breathtaking, and the fungi along the creek's edge was fascinating. I was lost in the patterns of nature, snapping pictures, oblivious to time. But when I checked my watch, a cold fist gripped my chest. It had been hours. Something was wrong. I called out for Kellen, but my voice only bounced back at me, swallowed by the dense forest. No answer. I pushed my unease down, but it swelled with every unanswered call. I started walking toward the creek, hoping he just lost track of time while fishing. That's when I found the first sign something was horribly, impossibly wrong. I stumbled across one of his fishing rods, snagged on some underbrush, right in the middle of the path. Kellen was meticulous about his gear. He never left it behind. My heart began to race. "Kellen?" I called again, this time louder, more desperate. There was no response. Panic began to rise in my throat. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he'd fallen, hurt himself somehow, sprained his ankle, maybe. I pushed forward, desperately trying to reason with myself, but deep down, I knew something worse had happened. I began to run, following the sound of the creek, hoping to find him. Then, I came upon a clearing. No more than 15 feet across, it seemed like a spot where others might have fished before. The ground was trampled, bits of discarded fishing gear scattered around. But something was horribly wrong. There, half submerged in the creek, was Kellen's neon green t-shirt, snagged on a jagged rock, the hem stained a deep, horrific red. I froze. The blood drained from my face as I recognized the shirt. It was the only one he'd packed. A few feet away, his sunglasses and hat were trampled into the dirt. And there were other things, small metal fragments, a broken pocket knife, more cloth, too much cloth. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with terror. Kellen was gone, and something had taken him. This wasn't an accident. The way his things were left behind, discarded carelessly, it all pointed to something far worse. As I staggered back, the reality set in like a knife to my gut. Someone had taken him. But why? Who could do something like this in the middle of the woods? Panic gripped me. If they took Kellen, I was next. I had to get out. I had to run. There was a ranger station not far away. I turned, almost blindly, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound of rushing water was my only guide, pulling me toward a way out. The world felt wrong as I sprinted through the trees. My lungs burned with each desperate breath, and the woods seemed to close in around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Then there was a sound, something not right. The brush parted ahead of me, and a figure emerged. He was massive, easily 7 feet tall, though hunched over, his posture twisted in a way that defied the human body. His clothes were ragged, a mismatched patchwork of browns and rough denim, and atop his head sat an old hunter's cap. Greasy strands of dark hair peeked out at odd angles. But what froze me in place was the mask, made of weathered, twisted leather, stretched and deformed into something that wasn't even human. It covered his entire face, no eyes, no mouth, just warped contours and tanned hide. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream. I could only stare in sheer terror as he took a slow step toward me. Then, in a blur of motion, he lunged. I turned and ran, my legs finally reacting to the terror that had frozen me in place. My breaths were ragged, my feet stumbling, the world spinning around me. But I pushed forward, a primal scream tearing from my throat. I could hear him behind me, the crunch of leaves and twigs, his heavy steps closing the gap. I reached the road. My fingers fumbled for the keys, but they slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor of the RV. I could feel his hulking form press against the window, his twisted face inches from mine. My hands were shaking as I managed to grab the keys, slam them into the ignition, and floor the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, nearly sending me into the trees on the other side of the road. I didn't care. I just had to get away. That summer ended that day, in that single moment. We never found Kellen. No sign of him, no explanation for what happened in those deep woods. For months, maybe even years, I couldn't bring myself to speak of it, even to myself. And now, years later, I wonder, what happened to that leather monstrosity? It couldn't have stayed confined to that wilderness forever. Did it claim more victims? Is it still stalking the dark forests, waiting beneath the towering trees? I can't shake the thought of it. And I can't help but wonder, if I cross those woods again, will I find myself face to face with that towering figure once more? This happened to me a few years back. I can't say it was anything like the movies, not a soundtrack, no slow-motion chase scenes. Looking back, I kind of wish there had been, because maybe then I'd have seen it coming. Me, my buddies Finn and Caden, we loved the solitude of the backwoods. We weren't hunters or anything, just guys who liked to get away, to disconnect. Caden had this old RV that his uncle wasn't using. Nothing fancy, but it worked. That spring, we decided to head up to Olympic National Park in Washington. That place is dense, like rainforest for miles. Makes for some incredible hikes, and you rarely see anyone else out there. It started like any other trip. We hiked all afternoon. Caden cooked up some franks and beans over the fire, and we cracked open a few beers as night fell. The air grew thick, and the fire crackled low. It was getting late, maybe midnight, when I woke up to scratching. At first, I figured it was a raccoon or some other animal, but it didn't stop. I nudged Finn. "Dude, hear that?" I whispered. "Think we got a visitor out there?" Finn mumbled something, probably told me to go back to sleep, so I sat up, straining my ears. The scratching stopped, then started again, this time further to the right. Whatever it was circling the RV. I reached for the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. My name's Heron Jacobs, by the way. I'm no city slicker. I've camped my fair share. Never been one to spook easily, but something felt wrong that night. My gut twisted. It was too big to be an animal, but it didn't move like a person either. My fingers brushed the cold metal of Caden's rifle under the bench seat. I gripped it hard. "Caden," I whispered, my voice hoarse. Nothing. The dude could sleep through an earthquake. I shook him awake, the scratching outside still echoing louder, matching the frantic rhythm of my pulse. Finn stirred, blinking in confusion. "What's up, man?" Before I could answer, there was a thud. A hard, sickening thud that made the whole RV shudder. I jumped up, aiming the rifle out the window, trying to spot anything in the darkness, but the blackness swallowed everything. Then came the scratching again, sharp, metallic. This wasn't an animal. Not with that force. Finally, Caden stirred. His eyes were wide with fear, and he stammered, "Start it up, man. Let's get the hell out of here." His hands fumbled for the keys. That was our plan. Always. If things went wrong, we fired up the engine and hauled ass. We had escape routes mapped out, safety nets, or so we thought. But when Caden turned the key, the engine sputtered, turned over, but wouldn't catch. He swore and tried again. Same thing. I looked outside, and my blood turned cold. The tires, someone or something had shredded them. No way we were getting out now. Frozen, we sat listening to whatever was outside, circling us, watching us. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Then the footsteps came, heavy, measured, slow, deliberate. They circled the RV, coming closer. I gripped the rifle tighter, finger hovering over the trigger. The steps stopped, right next to the driver's side, where Caden sat. I didn't see it, but I heard it. A slow inhale, something sniffing through the glass at him. Caden shrieked. A sound like nothing I've ever heard before. It sliced through the silence like a razor. Before I could react, before I could even shout at him to move, there was a crash. A massive fist punched through the driver's side window, spraying glass everywhere. I saw it just for a split second. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. No, not even that. Nine. He was too tall, impossibly tall. His clothes were filthy, ragged. His hair was a tangled mess. And his eyes. God, his eyes. Yellow, glowing in the moonlight like a predator's. That's when we bolted. Finn was out the door before I could even blink. Caden, bless him, grabbed a frying pan and smashed it across the thing's arm before running the other way. I don't know how, but I somehow managed to wrestle open the RV door. The lock was stuck and my panic flared. When it opened, I threw myself out, hitting the dirt face first. But Caden and Finn were gone. No trace of them. I couldn't stay there. My heart was hammering, pure survival instinct kicking in. I just ran. The forest swallowed me. Branches lashed my face, the cold night air burned my lungs, but I didn't care. I had to put distance between me and whatever was out there. The footsteps were close again, heavy, unmistakable. I knew if it caught me, there'd be no escape. I stumbled, tripping over roots, scrambling down an embankment. I must have blacked out for a moment when I hit the bottom. When I came to, I was still in the woods, and it was still out there. I could smell it. That sour, rotting stench. It was close, too close. Then I heard it. Screams, not one but two. Caden's voice, then Finn's. The screams stopped as quickly as they'd started, and then the thing kept moving. Each snap of a twig, every crack of a branch, sent fresh terror coursing through me. But with them gone, I had one tiny shred of hope. If it's busy with them, maybe I could slip away. I don't know how long I crawled through the underbrush. Hours, maybe. My body was drenched in sweat, my face raw, my mind slipping in and out of focus. At dawn, I finally stumbled onto a fire road. I flagged down a passing car, barely able to speak. The people were kind enough to let me use their phone. I called the rangers. They didn't believe me. Not for a second. They found the campsite, trashed. No sign of Caden or Finn. Just blood. A lot of blood. But not mine. I'm alive. That's what matters, I guess. But I'm telling you, don't go into the Olympic backwoods alone. I should have listened. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't human. And it's still out there. A few years ago, I was suffocating. I needed a break from the suffocating noise of city life. The endless drone of traffic, the unrelenting glow of computer screens. As a software developer, my days were spent buried in code, deadlines, and the sterile, artificial hum of the modern world. But every now and then I felt the pull, something primal, something ancient, calling to me. I wanted peace, real peace, the kind you can only find when you're utterly lost, alone in the vast expanse of nature. My name's Ellen, by the way. I'm the quiet type, the one who keeps to herself. After weeks of soul-crushing work, I decided I would find that peace, that isolation I craved. I'd drive to the Ford Pinot National Forest, pitch a tent, and disappear for a weekend. What could go wrong? I packed my gear into my old, groaning Ford Rodade and set off, feeling the weight of the world fall away as the city disappeared behind me. The hours on winding roads stretched on, the landscape slowly morphing into something wild, untamed, untouched. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to shift. The hum of civilization faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. By the time I found the trailhead, the sun was setting. The forest was unnervingly still. The rusting sign warned of bear activity, but I didn't care. I was here for solitude, and that's exactly what I was going to get. I followed the gravel track until I reached the farthest campsite, a forgotten place where nature had begun to reclaim everything. The fire pit, blackened and soot-stained, sat under the canopy of ancient trees as if it had been waiting for me. I set up my tent, nerves frayed but still determined. This was what I wanted. The first night, something felt wrong. A heaviness pressed down on me. The shadows seemed unnaturally deep, the air too thick. Every rustle in the wind, every snap of a twig made my heart lurch in my chest. It was nothing, I told myself. Just nerves. Just isolation playing tricks on my mind. I huddled by the fire, clinging to the flickering light of my campfire, trying to lose myself in the pages of a book. But as the fire began to die down, I heard it. A slow, rhythmic tapping. At first it was so faint I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But it was too deliberate, too regular to ignore. I tried to brush it off, but it gnawed at my thoughts. No wind could produce a sound like that. No animal would move like that. The next morning I found them. 3 smooth stones arranged in a perfect triangle just outside my tent. A chill spread through me as I stood frozen, staring at them. It wasn't random. Someone or something had been here. I told myself it was probably another camper, but deep down, I knew better. No one else would come here. Not to this forsaken place. I hurriedly packed up, my hands trembling, but something kept me there. A need to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I had to explore, to see for myself what was really happening. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the tapping started again. Closer this time, just behind the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, grew stronger with every step. Something, or someone, was following me, playing with me. I stumbled upon a crude lean-to built under the boughs of a decaying tree, half hidden by moss. Nearby I found a snare, its purpose unclear, but its presence a threat, a warning. A cold dread seeped into my bones. Who was out here? What did they want? The questions gnawed at me, but still, I couldn't leave. I had to know. I pushed on, the tapping never far behind, growing louder now, more insistent. The sound of it echoed in my ears. And every time I thought I was close to understanding, the woods swallowed my thoughts, turning them to shadows and whispers. Then I found the clearing. At first it seemed just like any other spot in the woods, until I saw the fire pit. Something about it made my stomach lurch. The stones around it, they weren't stones. They were bones. Human bones. Blackened, charred, some cracked, others gnawed on, as though something had fed on them, gnawing the flesh from the marrow. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then I saw him. From the depths of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was gaunt, skeletal, skin stretched so tightly over its bones it looked like it might tear. It was tall, too tall, hunched over in an unnatural way, ribs jutting out like broken branches. The tattered furs it wore were stained dark with old blood. But it was the face that stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't human. The mouth was a grotesque, unnatural grin, stretched wide beyond any human limit, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The eyes were empty, hollow, yet somehow filled with hunger. It just stood there, watching me, as if trying to understand what I was doing there. Then, without warning, it lunged. The tapping stopped. In its place was the sickening sound of bones snapping under the force of its attack. It was on me in an instant. Too fast, too powerful. My body couldn't comprehend the speed, the force of it. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes of blinding pain, the taste of blood, darkness swallowing me whole. I woke up 2 days later, my body a map of cuts and bruises, one eye swaddled in bandages. I was in a hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the air. A park ranger sat beside me, stone-faced, his eyes unreadable. The bruising on my skull was never explained, nor was the deep, unnatural fear in my chest. They told me it was a freak accident, an isolated incident in the woods. But I know what I saw. It's not the scars that haunt me, though. It's the tapping, that rhythmic, deliberate tapping that follows me wherever I go. In the quiet moments when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it. It starts soft, like a stone against stone, and I wonder if I'm the only one who hears it. What if something is still out there, watching, waiting for the next game to begin? I don't know if I'm the last one it will play with, but I pray I am. This happened to me a few years ago, though time's become a blur out there. It's like it's lost its meaning, the days and nights stretching on forever. I'm always alone deep in the wilderness when I go camping. My name's Harold, by the way. Been a bit of a wilderness junkie since I retired. Keeps me away from my wife's nagging, lets me clear my head. I need that. This trip took me into Olympic National Park. If you've never been, try it sometime. It's something out of a dream, beautiful, eerie, and untamed. After a few days of hiking and fishing, I felt the need to move, to find somewhere even more remote. So I packed up the RV and drove off, leaving behind the little campground, the familiar sounds of people. I was chasing the silence. I wanted to get lost. The road wound through the park, twisting alongside the northern border. I drove for an hour or so when I spotted a narrow pull-off, barely big enough for the RV. It looked like an old logging track, overgrown and forgotten. Perfect. The first night was normal. Made dinner, listened to the owls screeching, read a bit, then drifted off to sleep. But the next morning, that's when everything started to unravel. I went out for an early morning walk, stretching my legs and breathing in the damp forest air. I wasn't far into the trees when I froze. Right in front of me on the ground was a half-eaten deer. I'm talking about a mangled mess, its side torn open like something had ripped it apart with claws. No predator does that. Bears? Cougars? Maybe, but no. This wasn't natural. There was a sickening savagery to it, something that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I didn't want to dwell on it, so I turned around, headed back to the RV, hoping it was just some animal doing what animals do. But as I climbed back inside, I knew something wasn't right. The RV wouldn't start. Just dead. The engine refused to even turn over. Great. Just what I needed. Stuck. No cell service out here, no one for miles. I locked up the RV and decided to take a walk, hoping to find a signal, maybe even a ranger. Figured they could point me to a mechanic or help me out somehow. But that walk? That was my mistake. An hour or so into the muddy track, I found myself staring at the same goddamn deer carcass. But it wasn't just the deer anymore. There was something else. A sound, slow and heavy, like boots scraping over the forest floor. A deep rustling. I don't know what I saw, just a glimpse. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and hunched. Its movements were wrong, jerky, uneven, like it wasn't entirely human. It was walking on two legs, but it wasn't a man. No, this thing was something else entirely. It was massive, covered in matted dark fur, the kind of thing you see in nightmares but never expect to find in reality. My heart froze. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. I did. I don't remember the sprint back to the RV, but I must have been running for my life. When I finally reached the RV, it was getting dark. I locked every door, every window, and just sat there, my hands shaking, staring out into the forest. The only sound was the beating of my heart. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Huge, bare, almost human, but not quite. They were right there on the dirt, just beyond the RV's windshield, as if whatever made them had been standing right outside, watching me. I stayed inside all night, every crack of wood, every rustle in the trees making me jump. I ate a can of beans and hoped to God whatever I'd seen would stay the hell away. The next morning, the RV started up like nothing had ever happened, like nothing was wrong. I didn't care. I was gone. I didn't even stop to pack up. I just threw everything in the RV, slammed the door, and drove off like my life depended on it. I've never gone back to those old logging roads. Never will. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw. People ask why I never reported it, why I kept it all a secret. What would I have said? I saw Bigfoot? They'd lock me up in a second. No one would believe me. I've searched the news every now and then, checking for any strange disappearances or reports of something unnatural happening in the park. So far, nothing. And that scares me more than anything. Because what if it's still out there? What if it's still waiting, hidden in the trees? I'm sure of one thing. I'll never forget the terror in its eyes. This happened a few years ago, but it feels like a lifetime ago, like someone else's nightmare. I've always been the type to avoid the outdoors. Too many bugs, too much dirt. But my wife, Lyra, she lived for camping. After years of hearing her beg, she finally wore me down, convincing me to join her for a long weekend at Yellowstone National Park. We'd take the RV, pack up some supplies, and head into the wilderness. What could go wrong, right? Let me tell you right now. Nothing in the beginning hinted at the horror that was about to unfold. We packed up the RV and set out with a sense of naive excitement, even though I was already dreading it. The first day was perfect, like something out of a dream. The drive was scenic enough to distract me, and Yellowstone was even more beautiful than I had imagined. Majestic mountain views, the smell of fresh pine, crisp, clean air. I could almost understand why Lyra loved this place so much. By the time we reached our campsite near the shore of Yellowstone Lake, I had almost convinced myself to enjoy it. Almost. But day 2, that's when things started to get strange. We went on a short hike, a peaceful afternoon by the lake, and sat around the fire that night, trading stories under a sky full of stars so bright they almost seemed unreal. It was too perfect, too serene. And as anyone who's ever experienced true terror knows, perfection doesn't last. I had nodded off by the fire, lulled by the crackle of the flames, when something yanked me back to consciousness. It was a sound, sharp, unnerving, something snapping in the dark, beyond the light. My eyes snapped open. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But then the sound came again, closer this time, louder. It was too deliberate, too heavy, too human. Lyra's grip tightened on my arm as she whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded. Theron and Kellen were wide awake, eyes fixed on the dark edge of the forest, their bodies stiff with tension. "Yeah," Kellen murmured, his voice tight with something I hadn't heard before. "Fear." "That's not an animal." A sudden rustling broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of something walking on two legs. My heart stopped. "Lyra, do you see that?" I managed to whisper. She sat bolt upright, her wide eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that sent chills crawling down my spine. Then, the figure emerged from the forest, stepping into the fire's glow. For a long moment, time seemed to stop. The world stood still. There was something so wrong about this man's presence that my blood turned to ice. He was tall, at least 6 feet, and clad in mismatched hunting gear, with dirt smeared across his face. His clothes were torn, threadbare, and despite the freezing night air, he wasn't wearing a jacket, just a ragged shirt that barely hung on his gaunt frame. His beard was long and wild, but it couldn't hide the hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to scan every corner of the campsite, but never once settled on any of us. "Howdy," he drawled, his voice soft, too soft for someone who looked like that. It sent a shiver up my spine. He didn't seem interested in us. Instead, his eyes darted around the campsite, like a wild animal sizing up its surroundings. Kellen was the first to speak. "Can we help you?" Kellen's voice was shaky, a thread of fear woven into his usual calm demeanor. The man shifted, pulling something from his pocket. At first, I thought it was a gun, but when he raised it, I realized it was a knife. My breath hitched in my chest. "Just looking for some food," he said, his tone casual, almost bored, as he pointed the blade at our cooler. "Figured someone wouldn't mind sharing." We froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Was he threatening us? Theron, ever the peacemaker, didn't hesitate. He reached for the cooler. "We can definitely spare some food," he said, his voice too calm, too steady. The man tensed at the movement, the knife flashing in the firelight. The air thickened with dread. "Whoa, easy there," I said quickly, holding up a hand. "My brother just wants to help." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the man seemed to relax, the knife slipping back into his pocket as he stepped closer, reaching for the bag of supplies Theron offered. He took it, then without a word, turned and disappeared back into the dark forest, swallowed whole by the trees. Silence. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. None of us spoke for a long time, but we didn't need to. I could see the fear mirrored in their eyes, a reflection of what I was feeling. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay there, staring into the blackness, thoughts spiraling. Was this just some crazed drifter, or was there something more sinister in the woods? A threat we couldn't even understand. I had to shake the image of that hollow-eyed man from my mind, but it clung to me like a second skin. When morning came, the sight of the sun couldn't chase away the lingering dread. I stepped outside, trying to shake off the unease, when something caught my eye. A scrap of bloody cloth caught on a low-hanging bush. I thought it might be some animal's kill, but the nagging feeling in my gut pushed me to follow the trail. I didn't want to know, but I followed, and when I found it, I wish I hadn't. A pile of bones, human bones picked clean, some of them still bloody, scattered like garbage near the tree line. A wave of nausea hit me hard, and I staggered back, heart pounding. It was clear now, we weren't alone out here. Not just the man. There was something far worse lurking in these woods. I ran back to the campsite, my mind spinning with terror. When I told Lyra, Theron, and Kellen what I'd found, the horror was written on their faces before they even said a word. We knew without a doubt that this wasn't just an isolated incident. Something was hunting in those woods. We packed up as quickly as we could, the quiet of the lake's shore now sounding more like a tomb than a peaceful retreat. The world felt like it was closing in on us, pressing down with an overwhelming weight. We didn't speak much as we drove out of Yellowstone, but none of us needed to. We all knew that whatever had been waiting for us in the dark, it wasn't done yet. And I don't think we'll ever be free of it. A few years ago, I embarked on what would be my last solo road trip. For most people, the idea of traveling alone across vast, empty stretches of land sounds lonely, but for me, it was liberation. The constant hum of city traffic, the crowds, the endless noise, it all suffocated me. I craved the solitude of the open road. I wanted peace, quiet, and escape. My name is Harlan, by the way. My parents had a thing for giving their children peculiar names, but that's neither here nor there. I chose Utah as my destination, specifically the Red Canyons, a stark contrast to the suffocating gray of city life. I'd packed my RV as I always did, sleeping bag, hiking boots, maps, and enough granola bars to last a small army. But I wasn't prepared for what I would find in the depths of Zion National Park. Sure, I'd hiked the popular trails before, the ones teeming with selfie-snapping tourists and kids in matching shirts. But the allure had always been in the quiet, the solitude, the wilderness beyond the crowds. I'd read about a remote trail called the Cobb Narrows, a place where few ventured, where slot canyons and towering rock formations awaited those willing to seek them. It promised isolation and adventure, and I was eager to get away from it all. So, at the crack of dawn, I packed a light day pack and set off to find it. The first few miles were stunning. The sandstone cliffs rose like ancient sentinels, their hues shifting from pale cream to deep rust. Streams ran crystal clear beneath my feet, their waters so pure I could see the fish darting through the currents. But as the day wore on, the mood of the landscape shifted. The crowds disappeared, and the path grew narrower. The towering cliffs loomed closer, swallowing the sun. I lost my signal. A minor inconvenience, but I should have known it was a sign. By mid-afternoon, the trail had taken me to the edge of a dangerous river, its waters churning with a vicious current. The canyon walls pressed in on all sides, blocking out the sky. It felt like some ancient barrier, daring me to cross. But then it hit me. I'd been walking for hours, and I hadn't seen a single soul. The eerie silence began to claw at my nerves. No birds, no insects, not even a breeze, just the oppressive stillness. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. About 20 feet away, tucked in the shadow of a massive boulder, stood a figure. It was large, too large, and its shape distorted by the jagged rock behind it. My breath hitched as I tried to focus. I couldn't make out any features at first, but the outline was unmistakable. A man, or something that resembled one. And then I saw it, a slick crimson substance in his hand. My stomach churned as I realized what it was. Blood. My heart pounded in my chest, but the figure didn't seem bothered. It merely turned its head slowly, as if aware of my presence but uninterested in my fear. I couldn't meet its eyes. Those eyes, hidden behind matted hair and a tangled beard, felt hollow, empty. I didn't know if they saw me, but I knew they were aware of me. Then, just as casually as he had appeared, he slipped behind the boulder, vanishing into the shadows. For a moment, I stood frozen. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but it all collapsed under the weight of raw terror. The river no longer seemed like the greatest threat. No. The real danger was lurking in those dark corners of the canyon, waiting, watching. I don't remember running. I don't remember the climb back through the narrowing walls of the canyon. I only know that every rock I scrambled over felt like an escape from death itself. By the time I reached my RV, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I could barely form words when I stumbled into the park ranger station, gasping out something about a madman in the woods. They didn't believe me. The search party they sent out returned with nothing. No tracks, no sign of any person. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. The rangers gave me those hollow assurances. It's easy to get lost in the park. You might have just imagined it. The police seemed resigned to the idea that I'd had a heat-induced hallucination. Maybe they were right. Maybe my mind had cracked under the desert sun. But deep down, I knew what I saw. And it wasn't a hallucination. As time passed, my love for the outdoors began to fade. I didn't have some dramatic epiphany. It wasn't a sudden aversion to the wild. It was just fear. I would take the occasional hike, but when I saw people vanish around a bend in the trail, that primal fear took root. I couldn't shake the thought of those empty eyes, that looming figure in the shadows. Sometimes, when I hear stories on the news about missing hikers or disappearances in remote areas, my mind drifts back to that moment. That figure, lurking in the dark, the one whose eyes never seemed to see, but whose presence I felt deep in my bones. Maybe it was the closest I'll ever get to understanding what true evil looks like. And honestly, it's an experience I could have lived a full, happy life without. This happened to me a few years ago, but it feels like a lifetime. It was the same camping trip I'd done every fall, something I'd looked forward to all year. I'd load up my RV and head deep into the forest, craving that soul-soothing solitude. It was just me and nature, and nothing else mattered. I wasn't a survivalist, far from it. I grew up in the city, with all the comforts of modern life, but there was something about disconnecting for a week, leaving it all behind, that reset me like nothing else. This year, I drove out to the heart of the Ozarks in Arkansas, a place that had always called to me. The rolling hills, the crystal-clear rivers, enough dense, endless trees to get completely lost in. And for me, getting lost was the draw. It was an escape from the constant bombardment of life, work, social media, the constant hum of being connected. In the Ozarks, I became nobody, and that, I realized, was perfect. I parked my RV by a winding gravel road, tucked in a secluded corner where no one ever seemed to go. It was just my style, remote, untouched. I set up camp, then set out on the trails for a hike, finding a beautiful, winding path along the river, serene and quiet. I didn't see another soul. That night, I cooked dinner over the fire and fell asleep early. An ordinary day. Exactly what I needed. But that first night, something felt off. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, branches creaking, the soft snap of twigs. Normal things, yes, but my gut twisted with unease. Still, I brushed it off. Just the wind, I told myself. No big deal. I crawled into my RV and went to sleep, planning to check things out in the morning. The next day, I set out on my little scouting mission. No tracks, no signs of anything. Just the usual wilderness, the silence of the woods. What had I been worried about? Paranoia, that's all it was. So, I poured myself some coffee, sat by the campfire, and let the peaceful sounds of the forest drown out the tension from the night before. But that's when I saw it. A flash of movement deep in the trees. At first I thought it was a buck. It wasn't deer season, but there were all kinds of creatures out here. I felt that old curiosity stir in me. Slowly I crept toward it. But then it moved again, ducking deeper into the forest. Something was off. It didn't move like any animal I knew, and definitely not like a deer. The nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me to turn around, go back to the RV, lock myself inside, and forget the whole thing. But my stubbornness got the better of me. My name's Ellen Wilder, by the way. The sensible part of me screamed to retreat, but the thrill seeker in me pushed forward. What was the worst that could happen? The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. I was being drawn in, compelled by a need to know, to see what the hell this thing was. What was it hiding? The air grew thick, heavy. It wasn't just fear now, it was primal, raw terror, my instinct screaming for me to turn back. And then I saw it. This figure. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could identify. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, and its movements, fluid yet jerky, were beyond unsettling. The thing was crouched low, but when it straightened, its shape was wrong. Almost apple-like, but still distinctly human. It was constantly twitching, shifting, like it was adjusting itself, unnatural, like it couldn't settle. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move, but the terror seeped into my bones. It taunted me, slipping further away with each glimpse, like it wanted me to chase it, to follow it deeper into the woods. The longer I followed, the more my legs trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the fear that gnawed at me. Each time it disappeared, my heart raced faster, yet I couldn't stop. It was like I had to understand what this was. I had to know. Then, in a small clearing, I saw it. An old trapper's cabin. It wasn't abandoned, though. It looked lived in. Something twisted about the way it stood there, out of place, like it was meant to lure me here. The smell hit me next. It was vile, rotting flesh, but underneath that, something chemical, like burned plastic. It twisted my stomach, pulled me closer, even as every instinct screamed to run. But I couldn't. I had to see. I had to know. The door of the cabin creaked open, and what I saw inside shattered my understanding of reality. There were figures standing, unnaturally still, bathed in shadow. But these weren't people. These were things. Twisted, misshapen versions of humanity, each one grotesque in its own way, yet sharing the same chilling, unnatural stillness. They weren't human anymore, at least not in any way I could comprehend. Some jerked and twitched unnervingly, but others just stood there, locked in place, staring at me. Empty spaces where their faces should have been. Nothing but hollow, void-like pits. Then the first one moved. Its head snapped toward me, but where a face should have been, there was nothing. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty, wrong void. And then that scream. A high-pitched, agonizing wail, like metal scraping against metal. I thought my heart would explode. I bolted. Everything after that was a blur, screaming, running, feeling the trees tear at my skin. But the sound of them never stopped. It echoed in my head, in my bones. They were chasing me. I remember stumbling onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. My RV was in sight, just a few more yards. But those things, those creatures, they weren't slowing down. That eerie, unnatural moan was behind me, growing louder. Then my foot caught a hidden root, and I crashed to the ground, my body slamming into the gravel. Pain shot up my legs, my hands raw from the fall. I turned just in time to see them, looming at the tree line, unmoving. They weren't attacking, but they were watching, waiting. Something held them back, and I didn't know how much longer I had before they decided to come for me. The sun was beginning to set as I dragged myself, inch by agonizing inch, toward my RV. I crawled like an animal, praying that if I stayed out of sight, maybe, just maybe, they couldn't follow. Each inch felt like a lifetime, but finally my fingers scraped the door handle. I pulled myself inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it, and then scratching, clawing, something trying to get in. The night passed in unbearable silence, only broken by the faintest lingering moan. When the sun rose, I didn't wait. I grabbed the keys, ignoring the agony in my ankle, and tore out of there without a second glance. They never chased me again. But there are nights, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, that I swear I hear that moan again, that unnatural wail. And I remember, every time, that whatever they are, Whatever I saw in those woods, it isn't something any of us were meant to find. It wasn't a ghost story. It was something far worse. And I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble too close, to hear the call and follow it. They never caught me, but I know I was lucky. I can't explain it. Maybe they're experiments. Maybe they're victims of some sick cult. But the fear, oh God, the fear was real. The way they moved, the way they watched, the way they hunted me, it was like I was nothing but prey. I reported it, of course. The police didn't believe me. Hallucinations, they said. But the look in their eyes told me they weren't so sure. I think they searched the woods, but they never found the cabin. They never found what I saw. No missing persons, no reports, no answers. The silence speaks for itself. And now? Now I'm left with a broken body and a mind filled with unanswered questions. Maybe I'm telling this story for myself. Maybe I want someone to believe me. But maybe, just maybe, someone out there with the means and the will to investigate will go looking. And when they do, they'll wish they never had. Sometimes ignorance is bliss. Curiosity, though, it comes at a terrible price. And I know now some mysteries, some things are better left untouched. Just walk away while you still can. This happened a long time ago, though the years blur now. Maybe a decade. Me and my friend Kellen, we spent every summer hiking, fishing, camping along the Pacific coast. Growing up on the shores of Southern California, we were the kind of guys who lived for the wilderness, two souls in love with the forest, the sea, and the raw beauty of the untamed land. Back then, I had a hobby, photography. It wasn't serious, just something to pass the time. Kellen knew that, so when he suggested we head up to a new, secluded stretch of Olympic National Park in Washington, he asked me to come along and document the place. Naturally, I jumped at the chance. One sunny morning, we packed up my old RV. It wasn't much, but it was good enough for our adventures. Not exactly made for off-roading, but with Kellen behind the wheel, I figured we'd be fine. We crossed the Oregon state line and kept heading north until we turned west, venturing off the paved highways and onto a less certain path. As we drove, the trees closed in. Massive firs towered over us, their thick canopies blotting out most of the sunlight, casting eerie shadows along the winding dirt road. The farther we went, the deeper into the forest we sank. Every now and then, we'd spot a logging road branching off, but we stayed the course, trusting the GPS, though something about it felt wrong. Eventually, we found a place to stop, barely wide enough for the RV. A tiny creek ran nearby, cutting through the forest like a natural invitation. It was idyllic, serene, a perfect place to set up camp. The first day was as normal as any. Short hike, photos at sunset, roasted hot dogs. We were so used to these summer escapes that it felt like nothing could ruin the moment. The next morning, we woke to clear, crisp air, the faint scent of pine. We had breakfast, and then it was time to get started. I grabbed my camera bag while Kellen grabbed his fishing gear. The plan was simple. I'd wander around snapping photos, and Kellen would fish the creek. We figured we'd meet back in 2 hours for lunch. It was supposed to be just another lazy, perfect day in the woods. But time slipped away from me as I became lost in the beauty of it all. Fungi, moss hanging from ancient trunks, the way the light filtered through the trees. I didn't realize how long I'd been walking until I checked my watch. We were way past the time we'd agreed on, and I couldn't ignore the growing unease gnawing at me. I called Kellen's name. Nothing. No answer. My mind raced. Had he slipped, twisted an ankle, gotten lost? I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then I saw it. the first sign that something had gone horribly wrong. Kellen's fishing rod lay in the path, caught in the underbrush just off the creek's edge. His rod. He never left his gear unattended. Never. My stomach twisted into knots. I called out again, this time adding more urgency. Still nothing. A deep sense of dread began creeping in. This wasn't right. Panic clawed at me as I sprinted toward the creek, hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. I crashed through the trees, the sound of the water growing louder as I pushed forward. But then I broke through the underbrush and saw it. There was a clearing beside the creek about 15 feet across. At first, nothing seemed too out of place, just a spot where people might have fished. But then I saw the blood. Kellen's neon green shirt was caught on a jagged rock, the hem stained deep red. His shirt, the one he'd packed as his only extra, was soaked with blood. I knew it instantly. His sunglasses and hat lay scattered on the ground, trampled into the dirt. There was other stuff too, bits of metal, fragments of plastic, a pocket knife, more cloth. Too much cloth. I could hardly breathe. Kellen was gone, and from the looks of it, he hadn't left willingly. A cold, crawling sense of horror wrapped around my chest. No animal, no predator, attacked this way. This wasn't an accident. No. Someone had taken him. Someone had planned this, and the thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. If they'd come for Kellen, what stopped them from coming for me next? I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. There had to be a ranger station not far, maybe a trailhead, someone who could help. I spun around, desperately trying to find my way back, the sound of the creek still faintly guiding me. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the woods made my heart jump into my throat. I ran, panic surging through me, breath coming in ragged gasps. Then it happened. A sound. It wasn't natural. Something huge moving through the brush ahead. My heart stopped as a figure appeared, stepping into my path. He was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, hunched over in a way that seemed unnatural, like something that wasn't quite human. His clothes were a mishmash of old patchwork fabric, rough denim, worn-out leather. But the worst part? His face, or lack of one. A weathered leather mask, twisted, warped, and stretched out, covered his entire head. No eyes, no mouth, just skin contorted into an empty, grotesque form. I froze. My body locked in terror, unable to move, to scream. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, looming, watching. And then, with a sudden animalistic lunge, he was on me. I didn't think. I turned, legs finally finding the strength to carry me as my mind screamed for survival. My feet pounded against the earth, the sound of my breath mingling with the blood-pumping fear surging through my veins. Every step felt like I was being pulled into a nightmare, and yet somehow I reached the road. I threw myself into the driver's seat of the RV, fumbling for the keys, panic blurring my movements. The keys fell from my hand, clattering onto the floor, just as I heard his massive form crash against the window. His hulking frame pressed so close I could feel his breath on the glass. I couldn't think, couldn't move fast enough. Finally, the engine roared to life. I slammed the RV into drive, tearing out of there, barely staying on the road as I fought to control the wheel. My heart still thundered in my chest as I sped away, the shadow of that figure lingering in my mind. That summer ended for me that day. The nightmare never truly left. We never found Kellen. We never got answers. And I still wonder, what was that thing? What did it want? Did it claim more victims since that day? Is it still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the next soul to wander too far? The thought chills me to the bone. And sometimes when I'm alone in the wilderness, I can't help but wonder, will it find me again? A few years ago, though time bends and warps in the aftermath of something like that, and I can't quite say how long, something happened to me that I'll never forget. My name's Orson, but my friends call me I. It was just me and my cousin, Arara, up in the woods that weekend. The city gets suffocating, you know? A few days in the wilderness, breathing fresh air helps clear my head, lets me shake off the pressure. Arara is practically my sister, and we'd spent countless weekends hiking, camping, just getting away together. A trip like this always felt more like hanging out than a real vacation. We were headed to Olympic National Forest, a massive, untamed stretch of wilderness. One of the last places on the west coast where old-growth trees rise so high they seem to touch the sky. The moss-drenched landscape felt like something out of a dream, and the forest had a way of swallowing up sound so completely that you felt like you were the only two people in the world. I used to love it. This time, though, something went terribly wrong. By the fourth day, we found a secluded grove tucked between boulders, soft moss carpeting the earth. It felt safe, quiet, almost sacred. The sun was dipping behind the trees, throwing streaks of amber and purple across the sky. We had dinner, chatted, just enjoyed the stillness. That's when I saw it. It moved through the trees, something large, far off but unmistakably huge. It was the size of a bear, maybe 6 feet tall, but stocky, like a boulder covered in dark, matted fur. At first, I thought it was just a bear wandering off, maybe curious. So we decided to head inside the RV, better safe than sorry, right? We locked up, made ourselves comfortable, and went through the usual routine. Dinner, TV, the peacefulness of the night settling in. But then, I heard it. A scratching sound, nails dragging along the RV's exterior. Arara jumped. I jumped too, though I wasn't about to admit it. I peeked out the window, saw nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking. Probably just a branch brushing against the side of the RV. Probably. Then there was a thud. A hard, heavy thud, like something had just thrown its weight against the side of the RV. This was no wind, no animal. Arara's voice trembled. Do you think it's... Her sentence trailed off, her fear echoing in the air. We'd always joked about Bigfoot, the documentaries, the conspiracy theories, all of it. But this wasn't funny anymore. The night dragged on, an oppressive silence stretching between us, then another thud. This time, the RV rocked as if something, no, someone was deliberately throwing its body against the walls. It wasn't curious. It was angry. And it was here. Suddenly, there was a sharp metallic crack. I froze. Arara shrieked. I didn't have time to think before the RV started rocking violently. The metal creaked, the windows shuddered. Something was out there, pounding against the sides, trying to get in. It felt like hours passed in that corner, crouched low, waiting for the inevitable. My heart hammered so loud in my chest, I couldn't hear anything else. Then, through the crack in the blinds, I saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes, big, unblinking, piercing through the glass, even from a distance. It stood just outside the window, bathed in the dim yellow light of the RV. The eyes were like fire, cutting through the night, and beneath them I saw the outline of a massive, muscular form, shrouded in shadow. Long, matted hair hung from its broad shoulders. Its hands, God, its hands were monstrous. Fingers as long as my forearm, gripping the sill as if testing the strength of the glass. I couldn't see its face fully, thankfully, but that didn't matter. I could feel its gaze, cold and malevolent, as if it were looking through me. Then, just like that, it vanished. Not even a rustle in the leaves. It simply disappeared into nothing. Arara was sobbing now. I could hear her through the silence, her breaths jagged and uneven. Her voice trembled, broken, as she pointed to the window. I don't remember if I said anything. I don't think I could. The blood was pounding in my ears. We need to leave. Now. I don't know how I got the words out. I ran to the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. I didn't even care if the RV was about to fall apart. It started. It actually started. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared to life, and I didn't stop until I hit the freeway. Aurora didn't say a word the entire drive back. Neither did I. We didn't need to. When we reached a gas station, she called the police. Told them everything. Everything we'd heard, everything we'd seen. It felt so absurd. I couldn't believe I was saying it out loud. Of course, the police didn't believe us. They drove us back to the spot, checked around, found nothing. Just trees. Just the forest. We left that night, swearing off camping, at least up there. Neither of us ever spoke of it again, at least not in detail. But I still feel it. The image of those glowing eyes. The way it stood there, watching, waiting. The way it vanished without a sound. I don't know what it was, but I know now that some legends aren't just stories. They're warnings.